My name is Donovan Briggs, and I'm a hospital janitor who survived the first 72 hours when the Ice Age apocalypse hit Detroit. When Yellowstone erupted and ash blocked out the sun, I watched the world freeze over while trapped inside Metropolitan General Hospital. I had to choose between saving strangers or protecting the patients already inside, all while the temperature dropped to deadly levels and violent groups tried to take our shelter. My 18 years of mopping floors and cleaning rooms suddenly became the difference between life and death for everyone counting on me. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Donovan Briggs, but everyone at Metropolitan General Hospital just calls me Donnie. For 18 years I've been the head janitor on the night shift, which means I know this place better than anyone else who's ever walked these halls. Every room, every closet, every forgotten corner that the administrators don't even remember exists. I've got keys to places that most doctors have never seen, and I've cleaned up messes that would make a grown man sick to his stomach. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on November 12th, 2024. People always looked right through me. I'd be mopping the floor next to them and they'd talk about the most personal things like I wasn't even there. Doctors discussing patient diagnoses, nurses gossiping about their love lives, administrators planning budget cuts that would affect everyone's jobs. To them, I was just part of the furniture, invisible as the walls I cleaned every single night. That invisibility, that complete lack of attention from everyone around me, turned out to be the one thing that kept me alive when the world started ending. The night shift at Metropolitan General runs from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. 8 hours of walking these halls with my cart, checking every room, making sure everything is spotless for the day shift. I've got my routine down to a science. Start in the emergency department, work my way up through the surgical floors, finish in the administrative wing where nobody bothers me. My cart has everything I need. Industrial-strength cleaning chemicals that could probably eat through concrete, tools for fixing anything that breaks, and enough supplies to handle whatever disaster the day shift leaves behind for me. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10, grabbed my cart from the supply closet, and headed down to the emergency department. The news had been going crazy for the past 3 days about some kind of unusual activity at Yellowstone National Park. Seismic readings, gas emissions, all the technical stuff that makes for good television but doesn't really mean anything to regular people. At least that's what I thought at the time. The emergency department was busier than usual. Nothing crazy. Just the typical mix of heart attacks, car accidents, and people who thought their cold was worth a trip to the hospital. I was mopping near the triage desk when one of the nurses, Sarah, was talking to her colleague about vacation plans. She wanted to visit Yellowstone next summer, said she'd been saving up for months. I remember thinking how ironic that was considering what was about to happen. Dr. Martinez was working that night, one of the few people who actually acknowledged my existence. Good man, always said hello when he saw me, asked about my daughter, sometimes. He looked tired, more tired than usual, and he kept checking his phone between patients. Every doctor and nurse in the place seemed on edge, though I couldn't figure out why. The emergency department always had that underlying tension, but this felt different, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. I finished the emergency department around midnight and headed up to the 3rd floor. That's when I first noticed something was wrong outside. The parking lot lights were casting these weird shadows, and the air looked thicker somehow. I thought maybe it was fog rolling in from the river, but Detroit doesn't usually get fog that heavy in November. I made a mental note to check the weather when I got to the break room later. The 3rd floor is mostly surgical recovery, which means it's usually quiet at night. Patients are either sleeping off anesthesia or too drugged up to cause any trouble. I was working my way down the hallway when I heard shouting from the nurses' station. 3 nurses were crowded around the television, and their faces looked pale even under the harsh fluorescent lights. I pushed my cart a little closer, trying to hear what had gotten them so worked up. The news reporter was talking about Yellowstone, but his tone was completely different from the casual coverage of the past few days. This wasn't speculation about geological activity anymore. This was panic, barely controlled panic, coming through the television screen. The reporter kept saying something about a massive eruption, but the sound was too low for me to catch all the details. One of the nurses, Janitor, kept saying, "Oh my God," over and over again like a prayer. I continued cleaning, but I kept one ear on their conversation. Janitor was trying to call her husband, but her phone kept going straight to voicemail. The other nurses were doing the same thing, frantically dialing numbers and getting nothing but busy signals or dead air. That's when I started to get worried. In 18 years of working nights, I'd never seen the staff this panicked about anything. Around 1 in the morning, I was cleaning the 4th floor when every phone in the hospital started buzzing at once. Not just the hospital phones, but every personal cell phone that every staff member was carrying. The sound was like a swarm of angry bees, dozens of phones all vibrating and chiming and ringing at the same time. I pulled out my own phone and saw the emergency alert that changed everything. Volcanic eruption, Yellowstone National Park. Massive ash cloud detected. Seek shelter immediately. Avoid outdoor activity. Monitor local news for updates. The alert was time-stamped 2:47 a.m. Mountain Time, which meant the eruption had happened about 2 hours ago. 2 hours, and we were just now getting the warning. I stood there in the hallway staring at my phone, trying to process what this meant. Yellowstone had actually erupted. The supervolcano that scientists had been worried about for decades had finally blown its top, and somehow I was finding out about it while mopping floors in a hospital in Detroit. The chaos started immediately. Doctors and nurses were running between rooms, checking on patients, making phone calls, trying to figure out what they were supposed to do. Nobody had a protocol for this kind of disaster. We had procedures for tornadoes, for fires, for power outages, even for terrorist attacks. But a volcanic eruption 1,500 miles away? That wasn't in any manual I'd ever seen. Dr. Martinez found me in the hallway and asked if I'd heard the news. I showed him my phone and he nodded grimly. He told me that patients were already starting to arrive with respiratory problems, people who had been outside when the ash started falling. He asked if I could set up additional air filtration in the emergency department, maybe use some of the industrial fans from the maintenance department. It was the first time anyone had ever asked for my technical knowledge, and I felt a strange pride in being able to help. I headed down to the basement where we kept the maintenance equipment. The basement of Metropolitan General is like a maze, full of storage rooms and utility corridors that most people don't even know exist. I'd spent years exploring every corner of this place during my breaks, partly out of curiosity and partly because I liked having somewhere quiet to think. There are rooms down there that haven't been opened in decades, storage areas full of old medical equipment and supplies that got forgotten when the hospital upgraded its systems. While I was gathering fans and extension cords, I couldn't stop thinking about my daughter. Amanda lives in Sacramento with her mother, my ex-wife Lisa. They moved out there 5 years ago after our divorce, and I only get to see Amanda during holidays and summer vacation. She's 16 now, a junior in high school, and she's been talking about applying to colleges. I wondered if the ash cloud would reach California, if she was safe, if I should try to call her. I decided to wait until I got the fans set up. There would be time to make phone calls later, after I'd done what I could to help here. That decision, that choice to put the hospital's needs before my own desire to contact my daughter, probably saved my life. If I had tried to leave right then, if I had gotten in my truck and started driving west, I would have been on the highway when everything went completely to hell. The fans helped, but only a little. The air outside was getting thicker by the hour, and the emergency department was filling up with people who looked like they'd been rolled in concrete dust. Gray ash covered their clothes, their hair, their skin. Some were coughing so hard they could barely speak. Others were wheezing and gasping, their lungs struggling to process air that was more ash than oxygen. I improvised air filters using cleaning supplies and spare cloth from the laundry department. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. I showed the nurses how to set them up in patient rooms, how to create positive pressure to keep the ash from getting inside. For the first time in my career, people were actually listening to me, actually valuing my input. It felt good, but it also felt terrifying. If they were turning to the janitor for engineering solutions, things had to be pretty desperate. By 3 in the morning, the parking lot was starting to look like a disaster zone. Cars were covered in gray sludge that looked like wet cement. The ash was mixing with moisture in the air, creating this thick paste that stuck to everything it touched. I watched a man trying to scrape it off his windshield, but it was too thick and too sticky. He eventually gave up and just started walking, leaving his car buried in the parking lot. The temperature was dropping too. November in Detroit is already cold, but this was different. The ash cloud was blocking out the sun, and without solar radiation, the air was getting colder by the hour. It had been 45 degrees when I started my shift, typical for mid-November. By 3 a.m., it was down to 38 degrees, and it was still falling. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside around 4 in the morning and asked me a question that I'll never forget. He wanted to know if I thought the hospital could handle an extended emergency situation. Not just the rest of the night, but days or maybe even weeks. He was looking at me like I might have answers that the hospital administration didn't, and maybe I did. I knew the building systems better than anyone. I knew how much fuel we had for the backup generators, how much food was stored in the cafeteria, how much medical supplies were stockpiled in the various storage rooms. I told him honestly that we could probably handle a few days, maybe a week, if we were careful. But beyond that, we'd need outside help. We'd need supply deliveries, fuel for the generators, additional medical staff to handle the influx of patients. I didn't tell him about the old fallout shelter in the sub-basement, partly because I wasn't sure it was still functional, and partly because something told me to keep that information to myself for now. The roads were becoming impassable. By 5 in the morning, the ash and sleet mixture had created a gray ice that made driving almost impossible. I watched cars sliding off the road, getting stuck in the parking lot, giving up and being abandoned. The day shift was supposed to start arriving at 6, but it was becoming clear that most of them wouldn't make it. The people who were already here were going to be stuck for a while. I should have been scared. I should have been panicking like everyone else. But instead, I felt strangely calm. This hospital was my domain. I knew every room, every hallway, every storage closet. I had keys to places that most people didn't even know existed. If we were going to be trapped here, if this was going to be our shelter during whatever was coming, then I was probably the most prepared person in the building. The emergency department was overflowing by the time my shift was supposed to end. People with breathing problems, people who had been in car accidents trying to drive through the ash sleet, people who just needed somewhere warm to stay. Dr. Martinez asked if I could stay past my usual 6 o'clock departure time, help with crowd control and basic maintenance. I agreed immediately. Where else was I going to go? My apartment was 15 miles away through roads that were becoming more dangerous by the hour. I called my supervisor and left a voicemail explaining the situation. Then I called my ex-wife, in California, but the call wouldn't go through. All I got was a busy signal, which probably meant the phone lines were overloaded with people trying to contact family members. I'd try again later, when things calmed down a little. By 6:30, it was clear that the day shift wasn't coming. Maybe a few people had made it in, but most of the staff who were supposed to relieve us were trapped at home or stranded on impassable roads. The people who had worked all night were going to have to keep working, at least until conditions improved, enough for the regular staff to get to the hospital. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees and the ash was still falling. It wasn't as heavy as it had been earlier, but it was constant, adding another layer to the gray sludge that covered everything outside. The parking lot looked like a moonscape, all the familiar landmarks buried under several inches of volcanic ash mixed with ice. I was restocking supplies in the emergency department when one of the nurses asked me about food. The cafeteria had enough for maybe 2 days if we rationed carefully, but after that we'd be in trouble. I told her about the storage areas in the basement, how there might be emergency supplies down there that we could use. She looked at me like I was the most important person in the building, which was a feeling I'd never experienced before. Around 8 in the morning, Dr. Martinez made an announcement over the hospital's public address system. He explained the situation to everyone, staff and patients alike. The volcanic eruption had created conditions that made travel dangerous or impossible. The hospital was going to serve as an emergency shelter until the situation improved. Everyone needed to remain calm, conserve resources, and work together. I was checking the heating system when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, just a low rumble that I thought might be the building's ventilation system, but it was too irregular, too organic. It sounded like voices, lots of voices coming from outside the building. I went to one of the windows and looked out at the ash-covered parking lot. There were people out there. Not just a few stragglers, but dozens of them, maybe more. They were walking through the ash sleet heading toward the hospital. Some were carrying bags or suitcases. Others had nothing but the clothes on their backs. They all had the same desperate look, the same gray coating of ash that made them look like refugees from a war zone. The first group reached the main entrance, around 9 in the morning. They weren't violent or demanding, just desperate. They wanted shelter, warmth, medical attention for children who were coughing, and adults who were struggling to breathe. Dr. Martinez and the nursing staff did their best to help, but we were already overcrowded. Every bed was full. Every chair in the waiting room was occupied, and people were starting to sleep on the floor. I found myself in the strange position of being consulted about logistics. How many people could the building safely hold? What was the maximum capacity of our heating system? How much food and water did we have? These were questions that nobody had ever asked the janitor before, but suddenly my knowledge of the building's infrastructure was more valuable than medical degrees. The temperature outside had dropped to 28 degrees by 10 in the morning, and it was still falling. The ash cloud was blocking so much sunlight that it felt like late evening even though it was still morning. Some of the new arrivals were talking about the freeway, how cars were abandoned everywhere, how the whole city looked like it had been bombed with gray dust. I was in the basement getting more blankets when I heard the first mention of Yellowstone on the radio. A scientist was explaining how the eruption was going to affect weather patterns across the entire northern hemisphere. The ash cloud would block sunlight for months, maybe longer. Temperatures would drop dramatically. Crops would fail. This wasn't just a natural disaster that would be over in a few days. This was the beginning of something much worse. That's when I realized that my decision to stay at the hospital instead of trying to drive to California might have been the smartest thing I'd ever done. If conditions were this bad in Detroit, they were probably worse further west, closer to the eruption. My daughter was probably safer in Sacramento than I would be on the highway, assuming I could even make it that far. The heating system was struggling. The hospital was designed to maintain comfortable temperatures for a normal patient load, not for hundreds of refugees packed into every available space. I spent the morning adjusting thermostats, checking heating vents, making sure the system was running as efficiently as possible. It was holding for now, but I wasn't sure how long it would last if the outside temperature kept dropping. Around noon, I noticed that some of the newer arrivals were eyeing the food service area with looks that made me uncomfortable. We were rationing meals, trying to make our supplies last as long as possible, but people were hungry and scared. Hungry, scared people sometimes do things they wouldn't normally do. I made a mental note to talk to Dr. Martinez about security, maybe setting up some kind of system to protect our supplies. The radio reports were getting worse throughout the day. The ash cloud was spreading across the entire Midwest, and temperatures were dropping everywhere. Chicago was reporting similar conditions to what we were seeing in Detroit. Cleveland was actually worse off, with several inches of ash accumulation that was making it impossible for emergency services to respond to calls. I was cleaning one of the upper floors when I overheard a conversation between two doctors that made my blood run cold. They were talking about supplies, specifically medical supplies, and how long they would last with the current patient load. One of them mentioned that if conditions didn't improve soon, they might have to start making difficult decisions about who to treat and who to turn away. That conversation reminded me of something I'd learned during my years working in the hospital. Medical supplies weren't just stored in the obvious places like the pharmacy and the supply closets. There were emergency caches hidden throughout the building, supplies that had been stockpiled for disasters that never happened. Most of the current staff didn't even know these caches existed, but I did. I'd found them during my explorations of the building's forgotten areas. The problem was that accessing these supplies would require going into parts of the hospital that had been sealed off for years. Areas that were structurally sound, but not up to current safety codes, storage rooms that had been abandoned when the hospital upgraded its systems. I had keys to most of these areas, but I'd never had a reason to explore them thoroughly. If we were going to need those supplies, I'd better figure out what was down there and how to get to it safely. By mid-afternoon, the temperature outside had dropped to 25 degrees and the ash was still falling. The parking lot was completely impassable now, covered in several inches of gray ice that would be impossible to drive through. Anyone who hadn't made it to shelter by now was probably in serious trouble. The hospital was running out of space. Every room, every hallway, every waiting area was packed with people seeking shelter. Dr. Martinez was doing his best to maintain order, but I could see the strain on his face. He was dealing with medical emergencies, resource shortages, and the growing tension between the regular patients and the refugees who had sought shelter in our building. I spent the afternoon doing what I did best, staying invisible and observing. I listened to conversations, watched how people interacted, tried to get a sense of the mood in different parts of the building. What I learned worried me. The refugees were grateful for shelter, but some of them were starting to question why they were being denied access to certain areas of the hospital. They wanted to know what was behind the locked doors, what supplies we might be hoarding, why. The cafeteria was serving such small portions. The regular patients and their families were starting to complain about the overcrowding. They felt like they had more right to be there since they were paying customers, and they didn't appreciate sharing space with people who had just wandered in from the street. The tension was building, and I could see that it was only a matter of time before someone lost their temper. Around 4 in the afternoon, I was in the basement checking the building's main electrical panel when the lights flickered. It was just for a second, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. The backup generators were designed to kick in automatically if we lost power from the grid, but they only had enough fuel to run the essential systems for a few days. If the power grid failed, we'd be in serious trouble. I called the power company from one of the basement phones, but all I got was a busy signal. That probably meant they were dealing with widespread outages, which made sense given the conditions outside. Power lines would be vulnerable to the weight of the ash, and repair. Crews wouldn't be able to work safely in these conditions. The temperature outside had dropped to 22 degrees by evening, and there was no sign that it was going to stop falling. The ash cloud was so thick that it was almost completely dark outside, even though it was only 6 in the evening. It felt like the middle of the night, and the artificial lighting in the hospital was starting to feel like the only source of warmth and safety in the world. I was making my evening rounds when I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There were more people outside, walking through the ash-covered parking lot toward the hospital. But these weren't the same kind of desperate refugees we'd been seeing all day. These people were moving with purpose, and some of them appeared to be carrying things that might have been weapons. I found Dr. Martinez and quietly told him what I'd observed. He looked out the window and saw what I was seeing. His face went pale, and he asked me if there was a way to secure the building's entrances. I told him that I could lock most of the doors from the inside, but that wouldn't stop someone who was really determined to get in. The hospital's security system was designed to keep people from stealing equipment, not to repel an invasion. We decided to wait and see what the approaching group wanted before taking any drastic action. Maybe they were just more refugees seeking shelter. Maybe they were emergency workers trying to coordinate relief efforts. But something about the way they were moving, the way they seemed to be surveying the building as they approached, made me think otherwise. The first group reached the main entrance just as the sun was setting. Not that anyone could see the sun through the ash cloud. They knocked on the doors politely at first, asking to be let in. Dr. Martinez went to talk to them, and I positioned myself nearby where I could hear the conversation, but stay out of sight. Their leader was a man who said his name was Collins. He explained that they represented a group of survivors who had been organizing relief efforts in the surrounding neighborhoods. They wanted to coordinate with the hospital to make sure resources were being distributed fairly. They had vehicles that could still navigate the roads, and they could help with supply runs and communication with other survivor groups. It sounded reasonable, but something about Collins made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way his eyes kept scanning the lobby, taking inventory of everything he could see. Maybe it was the way his companions stayed close to the doors, positioned like they were ready to move quickly if necessary. Or maybe it was just my natural suspicion of anyone who seemed too organized in the middle of a disaster. Dr. Martinez was clearly torn. We did need help with supplies and communication. The hospital couldn't remain isolated forever, and cooperation with other survivor groups might be our best chance for long-term survival. But something about this particular group felt wrong, and I could see that Dr. Martinez sensed it too. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Collins becoming more insistent about gaining access to the building. He wanted to see our supply situation, assess our security needs, coordinate with our leadership. All reasonable requests. But Dr. Martinez was hesitant to let strangers into the building when we already had more people than we could safely accommodate. Finally, Collins made a statement that confirmed my worst fears. He said that in emergency situations like this, resources needed to be distributed according to need, not according to who happened to be in the right place at the right time. He said that hoarding supplies while people were dying outside was not just selfish, it was immoral. And he said that his group had the authority to make sure resources were distributed fairly, with or without the hospital's cooperation. That's when I knew we were in trouble. This wasn't a relief organization. This was a group that had decided to take what they needed by force, and they were using disaster relief as justification for robbery. I caught Dr. Martinez's eye and gave him a slight shake of the head. He understood immediately and told Collins that he needed to discuss the proposal with the hospital's administration before making any decisions. Collins wasn't happy with that answer. He said they'd be back in a few hours and he hoped the hospital would be more cooperative then. As his group walked away, I noticed that some of them stayed behind, positioning themselves around the building's perimeter. They weren't leaving. They were setting up a surveillance operation. I spent the rest of the evening quietly preparing for what I was sure was coming. I checked all the building's entrances, made sure the most vulnerable access points were secured, and identified the areas where we could move people if we needed to evacuate quickly. I also started thinking about the forgotten areas of the hospital, the storage rooms and utility corridors that could serve as hiding places if necessary. The temperature outside had dropped to 18 degrees by 10 o'clock, colder than it had ever been in Detroit in November. The ash was still falling, and the accumulation was now thick enough that it would be almost impossible to walk through without proper equipment. Anyone who was still outside in these conditions was either extremely well prepared or extremely desperate. Around 11 o'clock, just as I was finishing my preparations, the lights went out. The darkness that fell over Metropolitan General Hospital at 11 o'clock that night wasn't just the absence of light. It was the absence of everything we'd taken for granted. The hum of ventilation systems, the glow of computer monitors, the reassuring buzz of medical equipment. All of it disappeared in an instant, leaving us with nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the distant rumble of the backup generators starting up in the basement. I was in the main lobby when it happened, keeping an eye on Collins and his people through the windows. The emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting everything in that eerie red glow that makes everyone look like they're bleeding. The backup power system was working exactly as designed, but I knew it wouldn't last long. We had maybe 72 hours of fuel for the generators, and that was assuming we only ran the essential systems. Dr. Martinez found me within minutes of the power failure. He was trying to stay calm, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Losing power in a hospital isn't just an inconvenience. It's a death sentence for patients who depend on life support, kidney dialysis, or any of the dozens of other medical devices that require electricity to function. The backup power would keep the critical systems running, but not everything. We were going to have to make choices about what to power and what to shut down. The first choice was heat. The building's heating system was one of the biggest power draws, and running it on generator power would cut our fuel supply in half. But without heat, the temperature inside would drop to match the 18 degrees outside within a matter of hours. People would start dying of hypothermia before we ran out of generator fuel. It was a choice between dying fast or dying slow, and neither option seemed acceptable. I told Dr. Martinez about the building's layout, how we could close off sections to conserve heat in the areas where we had the most people. The hospital was designed with fire doors and emergency barriers that could be used to isolate different wings. If we concentrated everyone in the central areas and shut down the outer wings, we might be able to maintain livable temperatures for longer. The refugees who had been crowding the lobby were getting restless. They could see that something had changed, that the situation was more serious than anyone had been admitting. Some of them were demanding answers, wanting to know how long the power would be out, whether it was safe to stay in the building. Others were talking about leaving, trying to find somewhere else to shelter. I didn't have the heart to tell them that there probably wasn't anywhere else to go. Collins and his group were still outside, and the power failure seemed to have encouraged them. I could see them moving around the building's perimeter, testing doors and windows. They knew we were vulnerable now, and they were preparing to take advantage of our weakness. Dr. Martinez asked me about the building's security systems, whether the electronic locks would still work on backup power. Most of the locks were electronic, tied into the building's main computer system. Without full power, they would default to their fail-safe positions, which meant some would lock automatically and others would unlock. I had the master keys, but Collins and his people wouldn't know that. They'd assume that the power failure had disabled our security entirely. I spent the next hour moving through the building, manually locking doors and securing areas that we couldn't afford to lose. The pharmacy was the most important, followed by the medical supply storage and the food service areas. I also locked down the administrative wing, partly because it contained the building's main communication systems and partly because it had the most defensible layout if we needed somewhere to make a stand. The temperature inside the building was already starting to drop. The heating system was running on backup power, but it wasn't designed to maintain normal temperatures with all the exterior doors being opened constantly by new arrivals. Every time someone came inside, we lost more of the warm air we were fighting to preserve. I started sealing off the outer corridors, using plastic sheeting and duct tape to create barriers that would keep the heat trapped in the central areas. Around midnight, one of the nurses came to find me with a problem that I'd been dreading. The medical equipment in the intensive care unit was drawing more power than the backup generators could provide. We were going to have to choose which patients got life support and which ones didn't. It was exactly the kind of impossible decision that nobody should ever have to make, but someone was going to have to make it. Dr. Martinez gathered the remaining medical staff for an emergency meeting in the cafeteria. There were maybe a dozen doctors and nurses who had been trapped in the hospital when the power grid failed, and they were all looking at each other like they were hoping someone else would have the answers. The meeting didn't last long. Nobody wanted to talk about rationing medical care, but everybody knew it was inevitable. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I could hear parts of it from the hallway. They were discussing patient triage, trying to decide who had the best chance of survival with limited resources. It was the kind of conversation that doctors train for but hope they never have to have. The kind of conversation that changes you forever, regardless of what decisions you make. While the medical staff was debating ethics and medical priorities, I was dealing with a more immediate problem. Collins and his people were no longer content to wait outside. I could see them at various entrances trying to force their way in. They weren't being subtle about it anymore. They were using crowbars and other tools to attack the doors, and it was only a matter of time before they succeeded. I found Dr. Martinez after the meeting and told him what was happening. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour, and I could see that he was reaching the limits of what he could handle. The man was a good doctor, but he wasn't prepared to deal with armed intruders while simultaneously managing a medical crisis in a building without power. The first door gave way around 1 in the morning. It was a side entrance near the emergency department, one of the newer doors that relied entirely on electronic locks. Collins and 3 of his people came through that door like they owned the place, walking past the reception desk and into the main lobby where dozens of refugees were trying to sleep on chairs and floor mats. Collins wasn't interested in being polite anymore. He announced that his group was taking control of the building's resource distribution, and that everyone would need to register with them to receive food, medical care, or access to warm areas. He said this was necessary to ensure fair distribution and prevent hoarding. He made it sound like he was doing everyone a favor. Most of the refugees were too tired and scared to argue. They just wanted to stay warm and safe, and if that meant registering with Collins and his people, they were willing to do it. But I could see the expressions on the faces of the medical staff, and I knew they understood what was really happening. This wasn't resource management. This was a takeover. Dr. Martinez tried to negotiate. He explained that the hospital was already operating under emergency protocols, that resources were being distributed according to medical need, and that outside interference would only make the situation worse. Collins listened politely, but his response made it clear that negotiation wasn't really an option. He said that medical professionals weren't qualified to make decisions about resource allocation during a societal emergency, and that those decisions needed to be made by people who understood the bigger picture. I stayed in the background during this conversation, using my invisibility to observe and assess. Collins had more people than I'd initially realized. They were positioned throughout the lobby and the adjacent corridors, and some of them were carrying weapons. Not guns, at least not that I could see, but knives and clubs and other things that could do serious damage. They'd come prepared for resistance. The worst part was that some of the refugees were starting to side with Collins. They'd been listening to complaints about food rationing and limited access to warm areas, and Collins was promising them better treatment. He was dividing the hospital's population, turning desperate people against each other. It was a classic tactic, and it was working. I slipped away from the lobby and started moving through the building's service corridors. These were areas that Collins and his people wouldn't know about. Narrow passages that connected different sections of the hospital without going through the main hallways. I'd used these corridors for years to move supplies and equipment without disturbing patients or medical procedures. Now they were going to be my highway for moving unseen through a building under siege. My first priority was securing the most critical supplies. The pharmacy was already locked, but I needed to make sure Collins couldn't get to the food stores or the medical supplies in the emergency stockrooms. I also needed to find a way to protect the patients who were most vulnerable, the ones in intensive care who couldn't be moved easily. The intensive care unit was on the 4th floor, connected to the main hospital by elevators that were no longer working reliably on backup power. Collins and his people would have to use the stairs to get there, which gave me an advantage. I knew every stairwell in the building, including the ones that weren't marked on the official floor plans. If I needed to move patients or supplies, I could do it without being detected. I was checking the locks on the 4th floor storage areas when I heard footsteps in the main stairwell. Collins had sent people to explore the upper floors, probably looking for supplies or areas they could control. I counted at least 3 sets of footsteps, moving slowly and carefully. They were being cautious, which meant they didn't know the building's layout as well as I did. I used the service elevator to get back to the basement, where the backup generators were running. The noise down there was loud enough to cover any sounds I might make, and there were plenty of hiding places among the mechanical equipment. I needed to check the fuel levels and figure out exactly how long we could keep the generators running. The news wasn't good. We had maybe 60 hours of fuel left, and that was assuming we didn't increase the power load. If more medical equipment came online or if we tried to restore heat to the entire building, we'd run out of fuel much faster. I started thinking about ways to stretch our power supply, systems we could shut down without immediately endangering lives. The building's water system was still working, but it depended on electric pumps that were drawing power from the generators. If those pumps failed, we'd lose water pressure throughout the building. No water meant no sanitation, no way to clean medical equipment, and no way to fight fires if something went wrong with the electrical systems. Water was almost as critical as power, and we were using both faster than we could afford. I was examining the water pumps when I heard voices in the corridor outside the mechanical room. Collins had found the basement, and he was asking questions about the generator systems. One of his people seemed to know something about electrical equipment, and they were discussing ways to increase the power output or extend the fuel supply. That worried me. If they understood the building's infrastructure, they'd be much harder to outmaneuver. I stayed hidden among the equipment until they moved on, then followed them at a safe distance. They were systematically exploring the basement, mapping out the storage areas and mechanical systems. They were looking for things they could control or use as leverage. The basement contained the building's life support systems, and whoever controlled those systems would control the entire hospital. By 2 a.m, Collins had established what amounted to a headquarters in the main lobby. He'd positioned guards at the key entrances, and started organizing the refugees into work groups. Some were assigned to food distribution, others to security patrols, still others to maintenance tasks. It looked efficient and organized, but it was really just slavery dressed up as cooperation. The medical staff were being allowed to continue treating patients, but only under Collins's supervision. He'd assigned one of his people to monitor the intensive care unit, ostensibly to help with security, but really to make sure the doctors weren't using more resources than Collins thought appropriate. Dr. Martinez was trying to maintain some independence, but it was clear that he was being marginalized. I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I was just one person against a group that seemed to have thought through their takeover pretty carefully. They had numbers, they had weapons, and they had the support of some of the refugees. What I had was knowledge of the building and the ability to move around unseen. It didn't seem like enough. That's when I remembered the storage areas in the sub-basement, the ones I'd never fully explored. There were rooms down there that dated back to the hospital's original construction in the 1950s, areas that had been sealed off during various renovations and expansions. Some of those rooms contained supplies that had been forgotten for decades. If I could access those supplies, I might have resources that Collins didn't know about. Getting to the sub-basement meant using a stairwell that wasn't on any of the current building plans. It was a narrow spiral staircase that connected the basement to the lower level, hidden behind a door that most people assumed led to a storage closet. I'd found it years ago during one of my explorations, but I'd never had a reason to go down there until now. The sub-basement was cold, colder than the rest of the building, and it smelled like old concrete and rust. The emergency lighting didn't extend down there, so I had to use a flashlight to navigate. The corridors were narrower than the ones upstairs, with lower ceilings and pipes running along the walls. It felt like being in the bowels of a ship rather than a hospital. The storage rooms were locked, but my master keys still worked. The first room I opened contained old medical equipment, machines that had been replaced by newer technology but were still functional. X-ray equipment, surgical lights, monitoring devices that were obsolete but operational. If the newer equipment upstairs failed, these older machines might be able to take their place. The second room was more interesting. It contained emergency supplies that looked like they'd been stockpiled during the Cold War. Cases of canned food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, even some basic tools and equipment. The food was old, but canned goods can last for decades if they're stored properly. This was exactly the kind of resource that Collins didn't know about, the kind that could keep people alive when everything else ran out. The third room was the most intriguing. It contained what looked like a complete emergency shelter setup, with sleeping bags, portable heaters, communication equipment, and even some basic weapons. There was a logbook that indicated this had been set up as a fallout shelter during the Cuban Missile Crisis, then forgotten when the immediate threat passed. The equipment was old, but most of it looked like it was still functional. I spent the next hour cataloging what was available in the sub-basement storage rooms. There was enough food to supplement our current supplies for weeks, enough medical equipment to set up an independent treatment facility, and enough tools and weapons to make a real difference if we had to defend ourselves. The problem was getting this stuff upstairs without Collins and his people noticing. By 3 a.m, I'd developed a plan. It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than doing nothing. The key was using the building's service systems to move supplies without being detected. The hospital had a pneumatic tube system for transporting small items between floors, and there were also service elevators and dumbwaiters that could be used to move larger items. If I was careful, I could start moving critical supplies to secure locations throughout the building. I started with the medical supplies, using the pneumatic system to send medications and small equipment to the locked storage areas on the upper floors. The system was still working on backup power, and it was completely silent. Collins and his people wouldn't even know it existed unless they were specifically looking for it. The food was harder to move. Canned goods were too heavy for the pneumatic system, and the service elevators made noise that might be detected. I decided to focus on the most critical items first, the things that would make the biggest difference if we had to survive independently. Water purification tablets, high-energy foods, basic medications that could treat a wide range of conditions. While I was working on moving supplies, I was also thinking about the bigger picture. Collins and his group weren't stupid. They'd eventually figure out that someone was working against them, and they'd start looking for whoever was responsible. I needed to be prepared for that possibility, which meant having somewhere to retreat if my hiding places were discovered. The sub-basement wasn't just useful for storage. It also contained the building's original mechanical systems, including steam tunnels and utility corridors that connected to other buildings in the medical complex. If I had to evacuate people quickly, those tunnels might provide an escape route that Collins wouldn't know about. They were dangerous, full of pipes and electrical equipment, but they were also invisible to anyone who didn't know the building's history. By 4 a.m, I'd moved about half of the critical supplies from the sub-basement to more accessible locations. It was exhausting work, made harder by the need to stay completely silent and invisible. Every trip up and down the stairs was a risk. Every movement through the corridors was a chance to be discovered, but it was also the most important work I'd ever done. These supplies might be the difference between life and death for everyone in the hospital. I was making my last trip of the night when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps in the sub-basement corridor, moving slowly and deliberately. Someone had found the hidden staircase and they were exploring the lower level. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, hoping they wouldn't notice the door. I'd left open to one of the storage rooms. The footsteps got closer and I could hear voices. 2 people, maybe 3, talking quietly about what they were finding. They'd discovered the storage rooms and they were excited about the supplies. One of them was talking about reporting back to Collins about how this discovery would change their strategic situation. They were going to take credit for finding resources that could keep the hospital running for weeks. I waited until they moved on, then carefully made my way back to the main hospital. The sun should have been coming up, but the ash cloud was so thick that it was still dark outside. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and I could see frost forming on the windows despite the building's heating system. We were fighting a losing battle against the cold, and every hour that passed made our situation more desperate. Collins was holding court in the lobby when I returned, explaining to a group of refugees how his organization was going to improve their living conditions. He was promising better food distribution, warmer sleeping areas, and medical care for everyone who needed it. He was also explaining the new rules that everyone would need to follow, the work assignments and security protocols that would keep everyone safe. It sounded reasonable if you didn't understand what was really happening. Collins was creating a hierarchy with himself at the top, turning desperate people into a workforce that would serve his interests. The refugees didn't have much choice but to go along with it, but I could see that some of the medical staff were starting to resist. Dr. Martinez was trying to maintain control over patient care, but Collins was making it clear that medical decisions would have to be approved by his organization. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally happened around 5 a.m. One of Collins's people came up from the sub-basement and reported what they'd found. Collins's expression changed immediately, and he started asking questions about who had access to those areas. He wanted to know who had been moving supplies, who had keys to the storage rooms, who understood the building well enough to navigate the lower levels. Dr. Martinez tried to deflect the questions, claiming that the hospital administration had always maintained emergency stockpiles in various locations, but Collins wasn't buying it. He could see that someone had been actively moving supplies, and he wanted to know who was responsible. He started questioning the medical staff, demanding to know who had the knowledge and access necessary to operate independently of his organization. That's when I realized that my invisibility was about to become a problem. For 18 years, I'd been the person nobody noticed, the janitor who was present but not important. Now Collins was looking for someone who knew the building intimately, someone who could access areas that were supposed to be secure. It wouldn't take him long to figure out that the head janitor was exactly the person he was looking for. I started preparing for the possibility that I'd have to disappear entirely. The service corridors and hidden areas that had been my advantage could also be my sanctuary, at least temporarily. But I couldn't hide forever, and I couldn't help people if I was stuck in the sub-basement. I needed to find a way to continue operating without being detected, or I needed to find a way to neutralize Collins and his organization. The temperature outside had dropped to 12 degrees by 6 a.m, and the ash was still falling. The parking lot was now completely impassable, buried under several feet of gray sludge that had frozen solid. Anyone who tried to leave the building would be walking into conditions that were almost certainly fatal. We were all trapped together, predators and prey alike, in a building that was slowly running out of power and heat. Collins was getting more aggressive about finding whoever was working against him. He'd organized search teams to go through the building systematically, looking for hidden supplies and unauthorized activities. He was also questioning people individually, trying to identify anyone who seemed to know more about the building than they should. It was only a matter of time before someone pointed him in my direction. I was checking the generator fuel levels when I heard them coming down the basement stairs. Multiple people, moving with purpose, heading straight for the mechanical rooms. Collins had decided to take direct control of the building's life support systems, and he was bringing enough people to make sure nobody could stop him. The final confrontation was about to begin, and I was the only person in position to do anything about it. Collins and 4 of his people came down those basement stairs like they were conducting a military operation. I could hear their boots on the concrete steps, the low murmur of their voices as they coordinated their approach to the mechanical room where I was hiding among the generators. They weren't just exploring anymore. They were hunting, and I was pretty sure they were hunting for me. I had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the generator room. 30 seconds to decide whether to run or fight or try to talk my way out of this situation. The problem was that running would only confirm their suspicions, and fighting was a losing proposition against 5 people who were clearly prepared for violence. That left talking, which meant revealing myself and hoping I could convince them that I wasn't the threat they thought I was. I stepped out from behind the generators just as Collins entered the room. He wasn't surprised to see me, which meant he'd already figured out that the head janitor was the person he was looking for. His expression was calm, almost friendly, but his people were positioned to block my exit routes. This wasn't going to be a conversation between equals. Collins introduced himself properly for the first time, extending his hand like we were meeting at a business conference instead of in the basement of a hospital during an apocalypse. He said he'd heard good things about my knowledge of the building's systems, and he wanted to discuss how we could work together to improve conditions for everyone. It was the same reasonable tone he'd used with Dr. Martinez, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He wanted to know about the sub-basement, storage areas, how long I'd known about them, what other resources might be hidden throughout the building. He framed his questions as concern for the welfare of the hospital's population, but what he really wanted was a complete inventory of everything we had and everything I knew. He was trying to determine whether I was an asset he could use or a threat he needed to eliminate. I gave him honest answers about the building's layout and the emergency supplies, but I didn't tell him everything. I mentioned the storage rooms and the old medical equipment, but I didn't say anything about the steam tunnels or the connections to other buildings. I described the backup power systems and the water pumps, but I didn't explain how those systems could be sabotaged if necessary. I was cooperating, but I was also holding back the information that might be most important later. Collins seemed satisfied with my responses, at least initially. He said he was impressed by my knowledge and my willingness to help during a crisis. He offered me a position in his organization, a role coordinating building maintenance and resource management. He made it sound like a promotion, an opportunity to have real influence instead of just mopping floors and emptying trash cans. The offer was tempting, not because I wanted to work for Collins, but because it might give me access to his plans and operations. If I could get inside his organization, I might be able to sabotage it from within or at least gather intelligence that could help the medical staff resist his takeover. But accepting the offer would also mean abandoning the independence that had been my greatest advantage so far. I told Collins I needed time to think about his offer, that it was a big decision, and I wanted to make sure I understood what he was asking of me. He said he understood, but his tone suggested that my thinking time was limited. He wanted an answer soon, preferably before his people finished their systematic search of the building. The implication was clear: join them voluntarily or be forced to cooperate involuntarily. After Collins and his people left the basement, I had maybe an hour before they expected my decision. I used that time to move more supplies from the sub-basement to hidden locations throughout the hospital. If I was going to be under constant surveillance, I needed to make sure the most critical resources were positioned where they could be accessed without going through areas that Collins controlled. The food was the highest priority. The refugees were already complaining about the small portions being served in the cafeteria, and Collins was using their hunger as leverage to gain support for his organization. If I could establish alternative food distribution points, I might be able to undermine his control over the population. The problem was that distributing food required more than just hiding supplies. It required a network of people who could be trusted to help without attracting attention. I started with the medical staff, the nurses and doctors who had been working with me since the crisis began. They understood what was happening better than the refugees, and they had the most to lose if Collins gained complete control over the hospital. Dr. Martinez was obviously the leader of any resistance movement, but he was also the most visible target. I needed to work with people who could operate below Collins' radar. Jennifer, one of the nurses from the third floor, had been asking me about building security since the power failure. She was worried about protecting the patients in her care, and she'd noticed that Collins' people were paying particular attention to the areas where the most vulnerable patients were housed. I approached her carefully, testing her willingness to work outside of Collins' system. She was more than willing. She'd been a nurse for 15 years, and she understood that medical care shouldn't be subject to political control. She also had relationships with other staff members who felt the same way. Within an hour, I had a small network of nurses and orderlies who were willing to help move supplies and protect patients, even if it meant operating in secret. The temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees by 7 in the morning, and the ash was still falling steadily. The accumulation in the parking lot was now thick enough that it would be impossible to dig out vehicles even if the engines would start in these conditions. Anyone who had made it to the hospital was going to be staying for the duration, however long that turned out to be. Collins was expanding his control systematically. He'd established checkpoints at the major stairwells, supposedly for security, but really to monitor who was moving between floors. He'd assigned his people to oversee food distribution, medical supply allocation, and even access to the warmest areas of the building. He was creating a system where everyone had to go through his organization to meet their basic needs. The refugees were adapting to Collins's system faster than I'd expected. They were hungry, cold, and scared, and his organization was providing structure and the promise of improved conditions. Some of them were even volunteering for his security patrols, eager to have something useful to do and to demonstrate their loyalty to the new order. Collins was building a power base, and he was doing it by giving desperate people exactly what they needed most: hope. But the medical staff were becoming increasingly resistant. They'd trained for years to make decisions based on medical need, not political considerations. Collins's interference in patient care was creating situations where people weren't getting the treatment they needed, and the doctors and nurses were starting to push back. The tension was building toward a confrontation that could tear the hospital's population apart. I was restocking one of my hidden supply caches when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two of Collins' people were discussing their long-term plans, and what I heard made it clear that this wasn't just about controlling resources during an emergency. They were talking about establishing permanent authority over whatever remained of the local population after the crisis passed. Collins wasn't just the opportunist taking advantage of a disaster. He was someone who saw the collapse of normal society as an opportunity to create a new kind of social order, with himself at the top. The hospital was just the beginning. He was planning to expand his control to other buildings, other survivor groups, other resources. He was building an empire on the foundation of desperation and fear. That conversation convinced me that negotiation wasn't possible. Collins wasn't interested in cooperation or compromise. He was interested in dominance, and he would eliminate anyone who threatened his authority. If I was going to protect the people in this hospital, I was going to have to stop him completely, not just resist his control. The problem was that Collins had more people, better organization, and control over the hospital's main areas. What I had was knowledge of the building's hidden systems, and a small network of medical staff who were willing to help. It wasn't much, but it might be enough if I could find the right leverage point. The leverage point turned out to be the building's life support systems. Collins understood that controlling the generators and the heating system would give him ultimate authority over everyone in the hospital, but he didn't understand how those systems actually worked. He knew where the generators were located, but he didn't know about the fuel pumps, the ventilation controls, or the emergency shutoffs that were scattered throughout the basement. I started sabotaging his control subtly, making small adjustments to systems that would create problems without being immediately obvious. I adjusted the heating controls so that the areas where his people were stationed would be slightly colder than everywhere else. I modified the ventilation system so that the air circulation would be poor in the rooms he was using as headquarters. Nothing dramatic, just small inconveniences that would make his people less comfortable and less effective. The real sabotage was in the water system. The hospital's water pressure depended on electric pumps that were running on backup power from the generators. Those pumps were controlled by a system that most people wouldn't know how to operate, but I'd been maintaining it for years. By making small adjustments to the pump controls, I could create water pressure problems in specific areas of the building while maintaining normal service everywhere else. Collins's people started complaining about water pressure in their headquarters area within a few hours of my modifications. They were having trouble with toilets, showers, and even basic hand washing. Collins sent people to investigate, but they couldn't find anything obviously wrong with the system. The pumps were running, the pipes weren't broken, and the water pressure was fine in most of the building. It was just their area that was having problems. While Collins was dealing with infrastructure problems, I was expanding my supply network. The medical staff had identified patients who were at the highest risk if their care was disrupted, and we were working together to ensure those patients had access to medications and equipment regardless of Collins's resource allocation decisions. It wasn't easy, but we were managing to provide medical care independently of his organization. The food distribution was more challenging. The cafeteria was under Collins's direct control, and he was using meal distribution as an opportunity to address the hospital's population and reinforce his authority. People had to listen to his speeches about cooperation and resource management if they wanted to eat. It was effective propaganda, and it was winning him support among the refugees, who didn't understand the larger situation. I started distributing emergency rations from the sub-basement storage rooms, working with the nurses to identify people who were most in need of additional food. We couldn't feed everyone independently, but we could make sure that the most vulnerable people, especially children and elderly patients, had enough to eat. It was a small act of resistance, but it was also a demonstration that Collins' organization wasn't the only source of help. By 9 in the morning, Collins was starting to realize that someone was working against him systematically. The infrastructure problems, the independent medical care, the alternative food distribution, all of it pointed to organized resistance rather than random problems. He called a meeting of his key people to discuss security measures and to identify potential threats within the hospital population. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I was able to listen from one of the service corridors that ran above the conference room they were using. What I heard confirmed my worst fears about Collins and his organization. They weren't just planning to control the hospital during the emergency. They were planning to eliminate anyone who might challenge their authority once the immediate crisis passed. Collins was talking about identifying and isolating potential leaders among the hospital staff, people who might organize resistance to his authority. He was also discussing ways to make the refugee population more dependent on his organization, ensuring that they wouldn't be able to survive without his support. Most disturbing of all, he was talking about expanding beyond the hospital, about taking control of other buildings and resources in the surrounding area. The meeting broke up with assignments for his people to implement tighter security measures and to begin identifying potential threats. I knew that my name would be at the top of their list, along with Dr. Martinez and the other medical staff, who had been resistant to Collins's authority. We were running out of time to act independently. Soon we'd either have to submit to Collins's control or face the consequences of open resistance. I spent the next hour preparing for what was looking like an inevitable confrontation. I moved critical medical supplies to secure locations, established communication protocols with the nurses who were helping me, and made sure that the most vulnerable patients would be protected if violence broke out. I also prepared emergency evacuation routes through the service corridors, in case we needed to move people quickly. The temperature outside had dropped to 5 degrees, and the ash accumulation was now deep enough that it would be impossible to walk through without specialized equipment. The world outside the hospital had become completely uninhabitable, which meant that whatever happened inside these walls was going to determine who lived and who died. There was no possibility of escape, no chance of outside help, no option, except to fight for control of the resources we had. Collins made his move at 10:30 in the morning. He announced over the hospital's public address system that new security measures were being implemented for everyone's safety. All movement between floors would require authorization from his security team. All access to storage areas would be restricted to authorized personnel. All medical decisions would be reviewed by his resource allocation committee to ensure fair distribution of limited supplies. Dr. Martinez tried to object, arguing that medical decisions should be made by medical professionals, but Collins cut him off. He said that the crisis required extraordinary measures and that normal protocols were no longer appropriate. He said that anyone who interfered with the new security measures would be considered a threat to the safety of everyone in the hospital. The announcement was met with mixed reactions from the hospital's population. The refugees seemed generally supportive, grateful for the promise of better organization and security. But the medical staff were clearly upset, and several of them started arguing with Collins' people about access to patients and medical supplies. The division that had been building since Collins arrived was now out in the open. I was watching the confrontation from one of the upper floor corridors when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Collins had positioned armed guards at all the major stairwells, and they weren't just checking identification. They were searching people for weapons, contraband, or anything that might be used for resistance. This wasn't security. This was martial law. The search teams found some of my hidden supply caches within an hour of implementing the new security measures. They also found evidence of the modifications I'd made to the building systems, and they traced those modifications back to areas that only someone with extensive building knowledge could access. Collins now knew for certain that someone with my capabilities was working against him, and he was determined to find and stop that person. Dr. Martinez was arrested first, accused of hoarding medical supplies and interfering with resource allocation. They didn't hurt him, but they did confine him to a room under guard, effectively removing him as a potential leader of resistance. Several nurses were also detained for questioning, including Jennifer, who had been helping me with the supply distribution. I realized that I had maybe minutes before Collins's people came looking for me directly. They knew that the head janitor had the knowledge and access necessary to do what had been done, and they would be checking the basement and service areas where I'd been operating. I needed to disappear completely, at least until I could figure out how to respond to this escalation. The sub-basement was no longer safe. Collins' people had found it, and they would be watching it carefully. The service corridors were compromised too, since they'd found evidence of my modifications to the building systems. I needed somewhere that Collins didn't know about, somewhere that wasn't on any building plan or maintenance schedule. That's when I remembered the steam tunnels, the old utility corridors that connected the hospital to other buildings in the medical complex. They were dangerous, full of high-pressure pipes and electrical equipment, but they were also completely invisible to anyone who didn't know the hospital's history. Most importantly, they led to places outside the hospital where I might be able to find additional resources or alternative approaches to dealing with Collins. I made my way to the steam tunnel access point through a route that avoided all the areas where Collins had positioned guards. The entrance was hidden behind what looked like a maintenance panel in the sub-basement, and it required a special key that only a few people in the hospital's history had ever possessed. I'd found that key years ago in a forgotten tool cabinet, and I'd kept it more out of curiosity than any practical need. The steam tunnels were worse than I'd expected. The air was hot and humid, filled with the smell of rust and old metal. The pipes along the walls were scalding hot, and there was barely enough room to walk upright, but they led where I needed to go. to the other buildings in the medical complex, and potentially to resources that Collins had no idea existed. The first building I reached was the old medical research facility, a structure that had been abandoned when the hospital built newer laboratory space. The building was supposed to be empty, but I could see lights in some of the windows and signs that people were using it for shelter. If there were other survivors in the medical complex, they might be willing to work together against Collins' expanding control. I spent the next 2 hours exploring the research facility and making contact with the people who had taken shelter there. There were maybe 20 of them, a mix of hospital employees who had been trapped when the crisis began and refugees who had found their way into the building during the first night. They had their own food supplies, their own heating system, and their own concerns about security. More importantly, they had something that Collins didn't know about: communication equipment. The research facility had its own radio system, designed for coordinating with other medical facilities during emergencies. If it was still working, it might be possible to contact other survivor groups or even emergency services outside the immediate area. The radio system was functional, but the news it brought was devastating. The ash cloud had spread across the entire northern hemisphere, and temperatures were dropping everywhere. Cities were losing power, transportation systems were failing, and government services were breaking down. The volcanic winter that scientists had warned about was happening faster and more severely than anyone had predicted. The radio also brought news about other survivor groups in the Detroit area. Most of them were dealing with the same kinds of problems we were facing: resource shortages, power failures, and conflicts over leadership and control. Some groups had descended into violence, fighting over supplies while people froze to death around them. Others had managed to maintain cooperation, but they were struggling to survive with limited resources. I established contact with 2 other groups that seemed to be managing their situations better than most. One was centered around an elementary school that had been converted into a shelter, and the other was based in a shopping mall that had good defensive positions and substantial supply storage. Both groups were interested in cooperation, sharing resources and information that might help everyone survive longer. The communication with other survivor groups gave me an idea for dealing with Collins. He was assuming that the hospital was isolated, that there was no possibility of outside help or alternative sources of supplies. If I could establish regular contact with other groups, maybe even arrange for resource sharing or mutual assistance, I could undermine his claim to be the only option for survival. But first, I had to deal with the immediate situation back at the hospital. Collins had consolidated his control while I was exploring the research facility, and his people were searching systematically for any remaining resistance. The medical staff who hadn't been detained were being closely supervised, and the refugees were being organized into work groups that served Collins's interests rather than their own needs. I made my way back through the steam tunnels, carrying with me a portable radio that would let me maintain contact with the other survivor groups. The heat and humidity in the tunnels was exhausting, but it was also invisible protection against Collins's surveillance. As long as he didn't know about the tunnels, I could move between buildings without being detected. When I reached the hospital, I could see that the situation had deteriorated significantly. Collins had expanded his security measures, positioning guards throughout the building and implementing a system of identification checks that made it almost impossible to move freely. The refugees were being housed in designated areas under constant supervision, and the medical staff were being escorted whenever they needed to treat patients. The most disturbing change was in the intensive care unit. Collins had decided that some patients were using too many resources, and he was pressuring the medical staff to discontinue life support for people he deemed unlikely to survive. It was exactly the kind of decision that medical professionals should never have to make based on political considerations. But Collins was framing it as necessary resource allocation during a crisis. I needed to act quickly, before Collins consolidated his control so completely that resistance would be impossible. The other survivor groups had given me some ideas about tactics that had worked in similar situations, but they all depended on having more people and resources than I currently had access to. I needed to find a way to turn Collins's own advantages against him. The answer came from an unexpected source: the building's fire suppression system. The hospital had an extensive sprinkler network that was designed to activate automatically in case of fire, but it could also be triggered manually from control points throughout the building. More importantly, the system was connected to the building's water supply, which I'd already demonstrated I could manipulate. If I could trigger the fire suppression system in the areas where Collins had established his headquarters, I could create chaos that would give the medical staff an opportunity to act. The sprinklers would disrupt his communications, scatter his people, and force them to deal with immediate problems rather than long-term control. It wouldn't solve the overall situation, but it would create an opening for more decisive action. The fire suppression controls were located in a utility room that was supposed to be secured, but I still had my master keys. More importantly, the room was connected to the service corridor system, which meant I could reach it without going through any of the areas where Collins had positioned guards. It was risky, but it was also our best chance to disrupt his organization before it became completely entrenched. I was preparing to trigger the fire suppression system when I heard something that changed everything. Voices in the steam tunnel, behind me, getting closer. Collins had found the tunnel entrance and he was sending people to explore the connections to other buildings. My secret routes were about to be compromised, and my ability to operate independently was about to disappear completely. The voices in the steam tunnel were getting closer, and I could make out at least 3 different people coordinating their search. Collins had figured out that someone was using routes he didn't know about, and he was determined to map every possible way to move through the building unseen. I had maybe 2 minutes before they reached the section where I was hiding, and the fire suppression control room was still 50 feet away, through a corridor that would leave me completely exposed. I made the decision to abandon the fire suppression, plan and focus on getting back to the hospital before Collins' people cut off my retreat. The portable radio I was carrying would let me coordinate with the other survivor groups, but only if I could find a secure location to operate from. The steam tunnels were no longer safe, which meant I needed to find somewhere else to hide within the hospital itself. The service elevator shaft was my best option. It was a narrow vertical space that ran from the basement to the top floor, with access points on every level that were hidden behind maintenance panels. More importantly, it was a space that Collins's people would have no reason to search unless they were specifically looking for someone who understood the building's infrastructure. I could move between floors using the elevator cables and emergency ladders, and I could monitor what was happening throughout the hospital by listening at the access points. Getting to the elevator shaft meant crossing an area where Collins had positioned guards, but I knew the building well enough to find a route that would minimize my exposure. The laundry chute system connected to a utility room near the elevator shaft, and I could use that system to move without being seen. It would be uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, but it would get me where I needed to go. The laundry chute was exactly as unpleasant as I'd expected. It was narrow, steep, and filled with the smell of industrial detergent and old fabric. But it led directly to the utility room I needed to reach, and it deposited me there without anyone noticing. From the utility room, I could access the elevator shaft through a maintenance panel that most people wouldn't even recognize as an entrance. The elevator shaft was dark and cramped, but it was also completely secure. I could hear voices and movement throughout the building, but no one was looking for me in this particular space. I set up the portable radio and established contact with the other survivor groups, giving them an update on the situation at the hospital and asking for advice about dealing with Collins' organization. The news from the other groups wasn't encouraging. Several of them had dealt with similar takeover attempts, and the ones that had resisted successfully had done so by having more people and better weapons than the groups trying to control them. The elementary school shelter had survived an attack by establishing defensive positions and demonstrating that they could inflict serious casualties on anyone who tried to take their resources by force. But the hospital was different from the other shelter locations. We had vulnerable patients who couldn't be moved easily, and we had medical staff who were trained to save lives rather than take them. The tactics that had worked for other groups wouldn't necessarily work for us, especially since Collins already controlled most of the building and had the support of many of the refugees. The radio contact did give me one crucial piece of information. The shopping mall group had been monitoring emergency broadcasts, and they'd learned that government relief efforts were being organized in several major cities. Detroit was supposed to receive federal assistance within the next few days. assuming that transportation routes could be cleared and supply lines could be established. If government help was really coming, then Collins' control over the hospital was temporary rather than permanent. The question was whether we could survive his administration long enough for outside help to arrive, and whether that help would be able to deal with the larger crisis of the volcanic winter. The ash cloud was still blocking sunlight across the northern hemisphere, and temperatures were continuing to drop everywhere. I was monitoring radio traffic when I heard something that made me realize how desperate our situation had become. Collins was talking to his people about implementing what he called final security measures. He wanted to eliminate any remaining resistance within the hospital, and he was prepared to use whatever force was necessary to achieve complete control. Dr. Martinez was going to be the first target. Collins had decided that the hospital's medical leadership was too influential and too resistant to his authority. Rather than continuing to detain Dr. Martinez, Collins was planning to make an example of him that would discourage anyone else from challenging his organization. It wasn't clear exactly what Collins intended to do, but his tone suggested that Dr. Martinez was in serious danger. I had to act immediately, but I also had to be smart about it. Rushing in without a plan would just result in my capture or death, which wouldn't help Dr. Martinez or anyone else. I needed to create a distraction that would give me an opportunity to reach Dr. Martinez, and I needed to have an escape plan that would get both of us to safety. The building's emergency alarm system was still functional, powered by the backup generators. If I could trigger a fire alarm, it would force an evacuation of the area where Dr. Martinez was being held, and it would create enough chaos to cover a rescue attempt. The alarm controls were located throughout the building, including several points that I could reach through the service corridor system. I left the radio in the elevator shaft and made my way to the nearest alarm control point. It was located in a storage closet on the 3rd floor, hidden behind cleaning supplies that would discourage casual investigation. The alarm control was a simple pull switch, but activating it would bring Collins's people running to investigate the source of the alarm. I pulled the alarm and immediately started moving toward the room where Dr. Martinez was being held. The sound was deafening, echoing through the corridors and forcing everyone in the building to react. Collins's guards were trained to respond to emergencies, but they were also confused by an alarm that seemed to have no obvious cause. Dr. Martinez was being held in a patient room that had been converted into a makeshift prison. There was one guard outside the door, and he was talking into a radio trying to get instructions about the fire alarm. I approached him from behind while he was distracted, using a mop handle to knock him unconscious before he could call for help. Dr. Martinez was surprised to see me, but he didn't waste time asking questions. He could see that this was a rescue attempt, and he was ready to move immediately. I led him through the service corridors toward the elevator shaft, where we could hide until the alarm situation was resolved and Collins' people stopped searching for us. The elevator shaft was more crowded with 2 people, but it was still secure. Dr. Martinez was exhausted and shaken by his detention, but he was also angry about what Collins was doing to the hospital. He told me about the pressure that had been applied to the medical staff, the threats that had been made against patients, and the plans that Collins had shared for expanding his control beyond the hospital. Collins wasn't just interested in surviving the immediate crisis. He was planning to use the volcanic winter as an opportunity to establish permanent authority over whatever remained of the local population. He saw the collapse of normal government as a chance to create a new kind of social order, with himself as the leader of a community that would rebuild civilization according to his vision. The most disturbing part of Collins's plan was what he intended to do with people who weren't useful to his organization. The elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill, anyone who required resources without contributing labor or skills would be eliminated. He was framing it as necessary triage during a resource crisis. But Dr. Martinez could see that it was really about creating a population that would serve Collins' interests without question. We spent the next several hours hiding in the elevator shaft while Collins' people searched the building for us. They knew that someone had rescued Dr. Martinez, and they were determined to find both of us before we could cause more problems for their organization. The search was systematic and thorough, but they didn't think to look in the elevator shaft itself. While we were hiding, Dr. Martinez told me about conversations he'd had with other medical staff who were still free. Several nurses were organizing covert resistance, continuing to provide medical care independently of Collins's resource allocation decisions. They were also documenting what Collins was doing, creating a record that could be used against him. If outside authorities ever regained control of the situation, the temperature outside had dropped to -2 degrees, and the ash was still falling steadily. The accumulation was now deep enough that it would be impossible to survive outside for more than a few minutes without proper equipment. The hospital had become a completely closed system, and whoever controlled it would determine who lived and who died. Collins made an announcement over the public address system around 2 in the afternoon. He said that the rescue of Dr. Martinez was an act of terrorism that threatened the safety of everyone in the hospital. He declared martial law and announced that anyone found harboring fugitives or interfering with security operations would be considered an enemy of the community. The announcement also included new restrictions on movement and resource allocation. Food distribution would be limited to people who contributed labor to approved activities. Medical care would be rationed based on productivity and loyalty to the organization. Access to warm areas would be restricted to essential personnel and their families. Collins was using the crisis to implement social policies that would never have been acceptable under normal circumstances. He was creating a hierarchy where survival depended on usefulness and obedience, and he was eliminating anyone who didn't fit into his vision of an efficient community. It was exactly the kind of authoritarian system that emerges when normal legal and social structures collapse. Dr. Martinez and I decided that we had to establish contact with the resistance network among the medical staff. If we could coordinate our efforts, we might be able to disrupt Collins' organization enough to prevent the implementation of his most extreme policies. We also needed to prepare for the possibility that government help might not arrive in time to save the people Collins considered expendable. The portable radio in the elevator shaft allowed us to contact the other survivor groups and coordinate a more comprehensive resistance effort. The elementary school group had medical supplies that we needed, and the shopping mall group had weapons and equipment that could be useful in a direct confrontation. All three groups were dealing with similar problems, and cooperation might give us advantages that none of us had individually. We also learned about additional survivor groups that were operating in other parts of the city. Some were managing their situations better than others, but all of them were struggling with resource shortages and leadership conflicts. The volcanic winter was creating conditions where cooperation was essential for survival, but fear and desperation were driving people toward conflict instead. The most important information came from a group that had maintained contact with emergency services outside the immediate area. Federal disaster relief was being organized, but it was moving slowly because of the widespread nature of the crisis. The ash cloud had affected transportation and communication systems across multiple states, and emergency responders were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Help was coming, but it might take weeks rather than days to reach Detroit. We needed to survive Collins's administration for at least that long, and we needed to protect the most vulnerable people in the hospital from his policies. It was a race between outside assistance and internal collapse, and the outcome would determine whether the hospital remained a place of healing or became something much darker. By evening, Collins had implemented most of his new security measures. Guards were stationed throughout the building, identification checks were required for all movement, and work assignments were being enforced with threats of punishment. The hospital was starting to look less like a medical facility and more like a prison camp. But the resistance was also growing. More medical staff were joining the covert network, and some of the refugees were beginning to question Collins's authority. The fire alarm incident had demonstrated that Collins' organization wasn't as secure as it appeared, and that encouraged people who had been afraid to act. Dr. Martinez and I were planning our next move when we heard something that changed everything. Voices in the corridor outside the elevator shaft, and one of them belonged to Collins himself. He was conducting a personal inspection of the building's infrastructure, looking for places where fugitives might be hiding. The elevator shaft was about to be discovered, and we had nowhere else to run. Collins was standing directly outside the maintenance panel that led to our hiding place in the elevator shaft. I could hear him talking to one of his people about the building's infrastructure, asking questions about ventilation systems and emergency access points. He was being thorough, checking every possible location where someone might hide, and it was only a matter of minutes before he opened the panel where Dr. Martinez and I were crammed together in the darkness. Dr. Martinez was pressed against me in the narrow space, and I could feel his tension as Colin's voice got closer. We had the portable radio, some emergency supplies I'd gathered from the sub-basement, and nowhere to run if we were discovered. The elevator shaft had seemed like the perfect hiding place, but now it was about to become our trap. Collins opened the maintenance panel just as I was reaching for the emergency ladder that led to the upper floors. The beam from his flashlight cut through the darkness, and for a moment we were staring directly at each other across the narrow space. His expression changed from curiosity to satisfaction as he realized he'd found exactly what he was looking for. I grabbed Dr. Martinez and started climbing the ladder as fast as I could, hoping to reach the next floor before Collins could organize a pursuit. The ladder was old and unstable, designed for emergency maintenance rather than rapid escape, but it was our only option. Behind us, I could hear Collins shouting orders to his people, coordinating their response to block our escape routes. We reached the fourth-floor access panel just as Collins's people were entering the shaft from below. I forced the panel open and pulled Dr. Martinez through into a storage room that connected to the main corridor. We were back in areas that Collins controlled, but we were also closer to the medical staff who had been organizing resistance to his authority. The fourth floor was where the intensive care unit was located, and it was also where Collins had been implementing his most controversial policies about resource allocation. Several patients were being denied treatment because Collins considered them unlikely to survive, and the medical staff were being forced to watch people die who could have been saved with proper care. Jennifer, the nurse who had been helping me with supply distribution, was working in the intensive care unit when we emerged from the storage room. She was surprised to see us, but she quickly understood that we were fugitives from Collins's security forces. She led us to a patient room that was supposedly empty, where we could hide while Collins' people searched the more obvious locations. The patient room wasn't actually empty. There was an elderly man named Harold who had been abandoned by his family when the crisis began. Collins had decided that Harold wasn't worth the resources required to keep him alive, and the medical staff had been ordered to discontinue his care. Harold was conscious and aware of what was happening, but he was too weak to protest or defend himself. Dr. Martinez immediately began examining Harold, assessing his condition and determining what treatment he needed. Harold's situation wasn't hopeless, but it would require medications and equipment that Collins had declared off-limits for patients in his category. Providing the necessary care would mean directly violating Collins's resource allocation policies, which could result in severe punishment for anyone involved. Jennifer told us about the resistance network that had developed among the medical staff. There were maybe a dozen nurses and doctors who were providing unauthorized care to patients that Collins had written off. They were using hidden supplies, working in secret, and taking enormous risks to maintain their medical ethics despite Collins's political control. The resistance had been successful in saving several patients who would have died under Collins's policies, but they were also running out of supplies and safe spaces to operate. Collins was becoming increasingly suspicious of medical staff who weren't following his directives exactly, and he was threatening severe punishment for anyone caught providing unauthorized care. While Dr. Martinez worked on Harold's treatment, I used the portable radio to contact the other survivor groups and update them on the situation at the hospital. The elementary school group had agreed to share medical supplies, but getting those supplies to us would require coordinating a dangerous mission through territory that Collins's security patrols were monitoring. The shopping mall group had more encouraging news. They had been monitoring emergency broadcasts and had learned that federal relief forces were closer than we'd thought. A military unit was establishing a staging area about 20 miles outside Detroit, and they were planning to begin rescue operations within the next 48 hours. If we could hold out for 2 more days, we might have outside help in dealing with Collins. But 48 hours was a long time when Collins was implementing policies that could result in multiple deaths every day. Harold was just one of several patients who were being denied care, and there were rumors that Collins was planning more drastic measures to reduce what he called the resource burden of caring for unproductive people. Dr. Martinez finished treating Harold and turned his attention to the broader situation. He wanted to organize a coordinated response to Collins's policies, something that would involve the entire medical staff, rather than just the small resistance network. The problem was that most of the staff were being closely monitored, and any obvious attempt to organize resistance would result in immediate retaliation from Collins' security forces. I suggested using the building's infrastructure to support a larger resistance effort. The hospital had communication systems that Collins didn't fully understand, including the pneumatic tube network that could be used to pass messages between floors. There were also storage areas and utility spaces that could be used to hide supplies and equipment away from Collins's inventory controls. The plan we developed was complex and risky, but it was also our best chance to protect the patients, who were most vulnerable to Collins' policies. We would use the hidden supply networks to provide unauthorized care to patients Collins had written off. We would use the communication systems to coordinate resistance activities without being detected by his security forces. And we would prepare for the arrival of federal relief by documenting Collins's actions and gathering evidence of his violations of medical ethics and basic human rights. Jennifer agreed to serve as the primary coordinator for the medical staff resistance network. She had relationships with nurses and doctors throughout the hospital, and she understood both the medical needs of the patients and the political realities of operating under Collins's authority. She would organize the unauthorized care activities, while Dr. Martinez and I focused on the larger strategic situation. The first priority was expanding our access to medical supplies. The pharmacy was under Collins' direct control, but there were smaller supply caches throughout the hospital that he might not know about. I had identified several of these during my years of maintaining the building, and I could access them, using routes that avoided Collins's security checkpoints. The second priority was establishing secure communication with the outside world. The portable radio allowed us to contact other survivor groups, but we also needed to reach the federal relief forces and provide them with information about the situation at the hospital. Collins was likely to present himself as the legitimate authority when relief forces arrived, and we needed to make sure they understood what he had really been doing. The most dangerous priority was protecting the patients who were most at risk from Collins's policies. Harold was stable for now, but there were others who needed immediate intervention to prevent Collins from implementing what amounted to murder disguised as medical triage. We couldn't save everyone, but we could try to protect the most vulnerable while we waited for outside help. I left Dr. Martinez and Jennifer to coordinate the medical resistance while I focused on gathering intelligence about Collins' plans and preparing for various scenarios. The portable radio had given us valuable information about federal relief efforts, but it had also revealed how precarious our situation really was. Collins wasn't just planning to control the hospital during the immediate crisis. He was planning to position himself as the leader of whatever community survived the volcanic winter. The temperature outside had dropped to -8 degrees, and the ash accumulation was now deep enough that the hospital was completely cut off from the outside world. Anyone who tried to leave the building would die within minutes, and anyone trying to reach the hospital from outside would face equally impossible conditions. We were trapped with Collins until the weather improved or outside help arrived with the equipment necessary to operate in these conditions. Collins made another announcement over the public address system around 8 in the evening. He said that the hospital's resources were being strained beyond sustainable levels and that difficult decisions would have to be made about who could continue to receive care. He announced the formation of what he called a survival committee that would make life and death decisions based on rational criteria rather than emotional attachment. The survival committee was composed entirely of Collins' people, and their criteria for determining who deserved to live were based on age, health status, and potential contribution to the community's survival. Elderly patients, disabled patients, and anyone with chronic medical conditions would be evaluated for what Collins called compassionate end-of-life care. It was a euphemism for murder, implemented through the denial of medical treatment. Dr. Martinez was furious when he heard the announcement. He had spent his entire career fighting to save lives, and Collins was asking him to participate in a process that would result in preventable deaths. The medical staff were being put in an impossible position, forced to choose between their professional ethics and their own safety. The resistance network responded immediately to Collins's announcement. Jennifer organized a meeting of the medical staff in one of the storage rooms, where they could discuss their response without being overheard by Collins's security forces. The meeting was tense and emotional, with doctors and nurses struggling. To balance their desire to help patients with their fear of Collins' retaliation, some of the medical staff wanted to openly defy Collins's policies, regardless of the consequences. Others were afraid that direct confrontation would result in their removal from patient care entirely, leaving vulnerable patients with no protection at all. Everyone agreed that Collins's survival committee was morally unacceptable, but there was no consensus about the best way to resist it. Dr. Martinez argued for a strategy of passive resistance combined with covert action. The medical staff would appear to comply with Collins's directives while secretly providing unauthorized care to patients who were marked for elimination. It was dangerous and would require careful coordination, but it might allow them to save lives while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that could result in the complete collapse of medical care in the hospital. I supported Dr. Martinez's approach, but I also suggested that we needed to prepare for more dramatic action if Collins escalated his policies further. The survival committee was just the beginning of what could become a systematic elimination of anyone Collins considered undesirable. If we were going to stop him, we needed to be prepared to take more direct action than passive resistance would allow. The meeting ended with agreement to implement Dr. Martinez's strategy, while I worked on developing alternative plans in case the situation deteriorated further. The medical staff would maintain the appearance of cooperation while secretly undermining Collins' policies. I would continue gathering intelligence and preparing for various scenarios, including the possibility that we might need to take direct action against Collins' organization. Over the next several hours, the Resistance Network began implementing their covert care program. Patients who had been marked for elimination were secretly receiving medications and treatment, while the medical staff maintained careful records of Collins' policies for potential use by outside authorities. It was exhausting and dangerous work, but it was also the only way to maintain their medical ethics under impossible circumstances. I spent the time monitoring communications with the other survivor groups and gathering more detailed intelligence about Collins's plans. The portable radio revealed that similar situations were developing at other shelter locations, with leadership conflicts and resource disputes threatening the survival of multiple communities. The volcanic winter was creating conditions where cooperation was essential, but human nature was driving people toward conflict instead. The most disturbing intelligence came from my observation of Collins's private meetings with his key supporters. He was planning to expand beyond the hospital as soon as conditions allowed, taking control of other buildings and resources in the surrounding area. He saw the crisis as an opportunity to establish permanent authority over a large population, and he was prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened his vision of social organization. Collins was also planning to deal with the federal relief forces when they arrived. Rather than welcoming outside help, he intended to present himself as the legitimate local authority and negotiate from a position of strength. He believed that the federal government would be too overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis to challenge local leadership that appeared to be maintaining order and controlling resources effectively. The federal relief forces represented our best hope for ending Collins' control, but they also represented a potential disaster if Collins succeeded in positioning himself as their local partner. He could use federal resources to expand his authority while presenting his policies as necessary emergency measures. The resistance network needed to be prepared to contact the relief forces directly and provide them with evidence of Collins's actions. By midnight, the covert medical care program was showing results. Several patients who would have died under Collins's policies were receiving treatment and showing improvement. Harold, the elderly man we had found abandoned in the patient room, was responding well to the care Dr. Martinez had provided. The resistance was proving that Collins's survival committee was not only morally wrong, but also medically unnecessary. But Collins was also becoming more suspicious of the medical staff. He had noticed discrepancies in supply usage and patient outcomes that suggested unauthorized activity. He was planning to implement tighter controls and more extensive monitoring of medical personnel. The window for covert resistance was closing, and we needed to be prepared for more direct confrontation. I was monitoring the radio communications when I received a message that changed everything. The Federal Relief Forces had established radio contact with survivor groups throughout the Detroit area, and they were requesting detailed information about conditions at various shelter locations. This was our opportunity to provide outside authorities with evidence of Collins' actions before he had a chance to present his version of events. The relief forces were particularly interested in medical facilities, since hospitals were critical infrastructure for any long-term recovery effort. They wanted to know about patient populations, medical staff capabilities, supply situations, and leadership structures. They were also asking about security concerns and potential threats to relief operations. I spent the next hour preparing a detailed report about the situation at Metropolitan General Hospital. I documented Collins's takeover, his policies regarding patient care, his plans for expanding his authority, and his intentions regarding federal relief efforts. I also provided information about the Resistance Network and the Covert Medical Care program that was keeping vulnerable patients alive despite Collins's policies. Transmitting the report was risky, since Collins's people might be monitoring radio communications, but it was also essential, since the federal relief forces needed to understand what they would be dealing with when they reached the hospital. I used a frequency that the other survivor groups had identified as secure, and I transmitted the report in segments to reduce the chance of detection. The response from the relief forces was immediate and encouraging. They confirmed that they had received the report and that they understood the situation at the hospital. They also provided information about their timeline for reaching Detroit and their capabilities for dealing with hostile local authorities. Most importantly, they requested continued communication and asked us to document any further developments. The federal relief forces were planning to reach Detroit within the next 24 hours, but they were also warning that initial contact might be limited to reconnaissance and assessment rather than immediate intervention. They needed to understand the overall situation in the city before committing to specific actions at individual locations. This meant that we might have to continue resisting Collins for another day or two before receiving direct assistance. Dr. Martinez and Jennifer were encouraged by the news about federal relief, but they were also concerned about Collins' response when he realized that outside authorities were aware of his actions. He might escalate his policies in an attempt to eliminate evidence of his activities, or he might try to present the Resistance Network as the real threat to order and stability. We decided to maintain the covert medical care program while preparing for various scenarios when the relief forces arrived. The medical staff would continue providing unauthorized treatment to vulnerable patients, while I maintained communication with outside authorities and gathered intelligence about Collins's reactions to the approaching federal intervention. The next few hours would determine whether the hospital remained a place of healing or became something much darker. Collins had the resources and organization to implement increasingly extreme policies, but the Resistance Network had the moral, authority, and outside support to challenge his control. The outcome would depend on whether we could protect the most vulnerable patients long enough for federal relief to arrive, and whether the relief forces would be able to distinguish between legitimate authority and opportunistic exploitation of a crisis. As dawn approached on what would be our third day under Collins's control, the temperature outside had dropped to -12 degrees. The volcanic winter was intensifying, making survival outside the hospital completely impossible for anyone without specialized equipment. We were trapped together in a building that had become both sanctuary and prison, waiting for outside help while fighting to maintain our humanity in the face of policies that reduced human life to economic calculations. The resistance had grown stronger during the night, with more medical staff joining the covert care program, and additional patients being secretly treated despite Collins' survival committee policies. But Collins was also consolidating his control, implementing new security measures and preparing for what he clearly expected to be a final confrontation with anyone who challenged his authority. Federal relief was coming, but the question remained whether it would arrive in time to prevent Collins from implementing his most extreme measures. The next 24 hours would determine not just who survived the volcanic winter, but what kind of people we would be when the crisis finally ended.